In the dusty heart of Wyoming Territory, 1883, a simple trip to the railway station would change 2 lives forever. Calder Holt had driven his wagon to town expecting nothing more than livestock and supplies. Instead, he found a woman abandoned on a wooden bench, her traveling dress wrinkled from waiting, her eyes holding the kind of quiet desperation that comes from having nowhere left to go. Rosalie Quinn was supposed to be a mail-order bride, but her intended husband had died 3 weeks before her train arrived. Now she sat stranded, with $17 to her name and a carpetbag containing everything she owned. The townspeople whispered and stared, but offered no help to a woman they saw as a burden. That's when Calder, a man who'd lived alone for 15 years, made the most impulsive decision of his measured life. What happens when 2 strangers, bound by circumstance and loneliness, decide to marry before sunset? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered wooden bench where Rosalie Quinn sat had witnessed countless arrivals and departures over the years, but few as pivotal as this September afternoon. She clutched her carpetbag with white knuckles, the leather handle worn smooth by her nervous grip during the 3-day journey from Kansas. The letter in her coat pocket, now read so many times the creases had begun to tear, bore the careful handwriting of Harold Pemberton, the man who was supposed to be her husband, who was supposed to give her a new life, who was supposed to save her from the grinding poverty that had driven her to this desperate arrangement. But Harold Pemberton lay in the town cemetery, claimed by a heart attack 3 weeks prior, and nobody had thought to send word to stop the train carrying his intended bride. Calder Holt stood 6 feet from the bench, his worn boots planted firmly in the dust, studying this unexpected complication to what should have been a simple errand. He'd come to collect the breeding bull he'd ordered from Denver, along with the usual supplies and mail. Instead, he found himself staring at a woman whose quiet dignity reminded him of something he'd tried hard to forget, the way his Sarah used to hold herself when she was trying not to cry. The woman's traveling dress was a practical brown wool, mended at the cuffs but clean and pressed. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, with a few rebellious strands escaping to frame a face that spoke of resilience earned through hardship. She couldn't be more than 25, but her green eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen more than her share of disappointments. "Ma'am," Calder said, removing his hat and revealing hair the color of prairie grass in autumn, streaked with premature silver. "I'm Calder Holt. I own the ranch about 8 miles north of here." Rosalie looked up, startled by the gentle baritone voice. The man addressing her was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of honest work and the bearing of someone comfortable in his own skin. His face was angular, marked by years of sun and wind, but his brown eyes held a kindness that made her shoulders relax slightly. "I'm Rosalie Quinn," she replied, her voice carrying the faint lilt of Irish ancestry. "I suppose you've heard my story by now. Bad news travels fast in small towns." Calder nodded slowly. "Some of it. Enough to know you're in a difficult situation." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the depot platform, and Calder found himself remembering another woman who'd once waited for him, though Sarah had been his childhood sweetheart, not a stranger brought by desperate circumstances. Sarah, who died 5 winters ago from the lung fever that had swept through the territory, leaving him alone in a house suddenly too big and too quiet. "I've been sitting here for 3 hours, Rosalie said, gesturing to the bench as if it were an old friend, trying to figure out what comes next. "The station master says there's a train east tomorrow morning, but—" She paused, then continued with the kind of honesty that comes from having nothing left to lose. "I used most of my money for the ticket here. I've got $17 and whatever I can carry in this bag." Calder glanced toward the station house, where he could see faces pressed against the windows. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, held court with her usual circle of gossips, their heads bent together like conspirators. He'd lived in Millbrook long enough to know that Rosalie's situation would be the talk of every dinner table tonight, and not in a kind way. The memory of Sarah's recipe box, still sitting exactly where she'd left it in their kitchen, flickered through his mind. He'd kept everything just as it was. Her sewing basket by the window, her favorite chair at the table, even her nightgown still folded in the drawer. For 5 years, he'd been living like a caretaker in a museum, preserving a life that was gone, rather than building a new one. "Miss Quinn," he said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice, "I have a proposition that might sound a bit unconventional." Rosalie's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "My ranch is profitable, enough to support a family, though I've been working it alone since my wife passed. The house is sound, the land is good, and I'm not given to drinking or gambling or any of the vices that make a man unreliable." He paused, aware that he was approaching this like a business transaction, which perhaps it was. "I'm offering you a marriage of convenience, a roof over your head, your own space, and the security of a legal arrangement. In return, you'd help with the household duties and perhaps some of the ranch work if you're inclined." The words hung in the air between them like morning mist, fragile and uncertain. Rosalie studied his face, searching for signs of deception or ulterior motives. What she found instead was a man who seemed as surprised by his offer as she was. "You don't know anything about me," she said finally. "I could be a thief or worse." "Could be," Calder agreed. "But you're not. A woman who's been sitting on a bench for 3 hours, worrying about her next meal, doesn't strike me as someone with criminal intent. Besides," he added with a slight smile that transformed his weathered features, "I'm a pretty good judge of character. Comes from years of dealing with horses and cattle." Rosalie felt something unexpected flutter in her chest. Not quite hope, but the faint possibility of it. "And you do this for a complete stranger?" "Maybe it's not entirely selfless," Calder admitted. "I've been alone long enough to know it's not a natural state for most folks, and this town has a way of making single women into subjects of speculation and gossip. A marriage, even a practical one, would give you standing and protection." The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold. In the distance, the mountains stood like silent sentinels, their peaks catching the last light of day. Rosalie thought of the letter in her pocket, the careful plans that had brought her here, the hope that had sustained her through the long journey west. "If I agreed," she said slowly, "what would the arrangements be?" "Separate rooms," Calder said immediately. "No expectations beyond what we discuss and agree upon. You'd be free to leave if you chose, though I'd ask that you give it an honest try first. And if it doesn't work, if we find we can't live together peacefully, then we'll part as friends, and I'll make sure you have enough money to get wherever you want to go." Rosalie looked around the depot one more time, taking in the curious stares and whispered conversations. The alternative was returning east, with her pride in tatters and her future uncertain. At least here, with this strange, kind man, she had a chance at something resembling a life. "Mr. Holt," she said, rising from the bench and smoothing her skirts, "I believe I'd like to accept your unconventional proposition." Calder felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening after being locked too long. "The preacher lives just down the street. If we're going to do this, we should do it properly." "Before sunset?" Rosalie asked, echoing the time frame that had become their unlikely deadline. "Before sunset," Calder confirmed, offering her his arm. "Mrs. Holt." The name sounded strange on his tongue, but not unpleasant. As they walked toward the parsonage, Rosalie's hand light on his arm, Calder found himself thinking that perhaps Sarah would understand. She'd always said that life was meant to be lived, not just endured, and he'd been doing far too much enduring in recent years. Behind them, the bench sat empty in the gathering dusk, having served its purpose as the unlikely stage for two lonely souls to find each other. The depot clock chimed the hour, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle echoed across the plains, carrying the promise of new journeys and fresh beginnings. The morning sun crept through the lace curtains of what had been Sarah's kitchen, casting delicate patterns across the pine table where Calder sat with his coffee growing cold. Across from him, Rosalie moved with careful precision, her mother's cameo brooch catching the light as she bent to retrieve the eggs from the skillet. The small piece of jewelry was one of the few things of value she owned, and she touched it unconsciously whenever uncertainty crept into her movements. Their wedding had been a brief, businesslike affair conducted by Reverend Morrison in his parlor with his wife and the town clerk serving as witnesses. Rosalie had signed her new name with a steady hand, though her voice had trembled slightly when she spoke the vows. They'd ridden back to the ranch in Calder's wagon as the stars emerged, speaking little, but not uncomfortably so. Now, in the harsh light of their first morning as husband and wife, the reality of their arrangement settled between them like an uninvited guest. "I found some flour and bacon in the pantry," Rosalie said, placing a plate before him. "I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of cooking." Calder looked down at the perfectly prepared eggs, the bacon crisp but not burned, the biscuits golden and fragrant. It had been years since anyone had cooked for him, and the simple act stirred emotions he wasn't prepared to examine. "It's fine," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "I usually just have coffee and whatever's handy." Rosalie settled into the chair across from him, her own plate considerably smaller. She'd learned long ago to take less, to make do with whatever remained. The habit of scarcity wasn't easily broken. "About the household arrangements," she began, then paused, unsure how to navigate this conversation. "I noticed that the bedroom upstairs, it looks like it hasn't been disturbed." Calder's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Sarah's room, their room, remained exactly as she'd left it. Her brush on the dresser, her shawl draped over the rocking chair, even the book she'd been reading still open to the page where she'd marked her place with a pressed flower. "I sleep downstairs now," he said curtly. "The room off the kitchen, you can have the upstairs. I don't want to intrude on—" "It's not an intrusion." The words came out sharper than he'd intended, and he saw Rosalie flinch slightly. "I mean, it's practical. More space for you up there." What he couldn't say was that he hadn't been able to sleep in that room since Sarah died, that he'd tried once, about a year after the funeral, and had spent the night sitting in the chair beside the bed, overwhelmed by the scent of lavender that still clung to her pillow. Rosalie nodded, recognizing the closed door in his expression. She understood about doors that couldn't be opened, secrets too painful to share with strangers. Her own past was full of such doors. "I'll need to understand the routine here," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "The ranch work, I mean. I'm not afraid of hard work. Can you ride?" "Some. I grew up on a farm before." She caught herself before mentioning the circumstances that had led to her departure from home. "Before I came west." Calder studied her face, noting the way her fingers worried the edge of her napkin. There were stories there, he realized, probably. Painful ones? Well, they were both entitled to their private griefs. "I'll teach you what you need to know about the horses," he said. "The cattle mostly take care of themselves this time of year, but there's always mending to do, feed to distribute, equipment to maintain. And the house? Do what you think needs doing. I'm not particular about most things." But even as he said it, Calder felt a pang of anxiety. The house had been frozen in time for 5 years, and the thought of change, even necessary change, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. After breakfast, Rosalie explored her new home, while Calder tended to the morning chores. The house was solidly built, with wide plank floors and generous windows that let in the prairie light, but it felt suspended somehow, as if waiting for permission to continue existing. In the parlor, she found a daguerreotype of a young woman with kind eyes and gentle smile. Sarah, she assumed. The resemblance to herself was superficial but present. The auburn hair, the small frame, the air of quiet strength. She wondered if Calder had noticed, if that resemblance had influenced his impulsive proposal. The kitchen was well appointed, but bore the signs of a man cooking for himself. mismatched dishes, a shortage of proper utensils, herbs and spices used with more enthusiasm than knowledge. Rosalie found herself mentally cataloguing what needed attention, her hands already itching to restore order and warmth to the space. It was in the pantry that she discovered Sarah's recipe box, pushed to the back of a high shelf, as if hidden from sight. The wooden box was beautifully crafted, with brass hinges and a delicate floral design burned into the lid. Inside were dozens of cards written in a flowing script, each one a testament to a life lived fully. Recipes for Sunday dinners, holiday. Treats, remedies for common ailments. Rosalie held one of the cards up to the light, reading the careful instructions for apple cake written in fading ink. At the bottom, in the same hand, was a note. Calder's favorite, always make extra for the hired hands. The intimacy of it struck her like a physical blow. These weren't just recipes, they were love letters written in flour and sugar, evidence of a partnership that had been cut tragically short. She was holding the remnants of another woman's life, another woman's love, and suddenly the magnitude of her situation crashed over her. What was she doing here? What right did she have to step into this house, to use this kitchen, to sleep in the bed of a woman who was clearly still so present in every corner of this home? The sound of boots on the porch made her quickly return the box to its hiding place. But not before one of the recipe cards fluttered to the floor. She was bending to retrieve it when Calder appeared in the doorway. "I thought I'd show you the barn," he said, then stopped as he saw what she held in her hand. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Calder's eyes moved from the recipe card to the pantry shelf where the box was imperfectly concealed, and Rosalie saw something shift in his expression. A door slamming shut, walls going up. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just organizing the pantry and I found—" "Don't." The single word cut through her explanation like a blade. "Don't touch her things." The coldness in his voice was so different from the gentle man who had offered her refuge that Rosalie took a step backward. This was the grief she'd sensed beneath his kindness, the wound that hadn't healed despite 5 years of trying. "I understand," she said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude." But Calder was already turning away, his shoulders rigid with tension. "I'll be in the barn when you're ready for that tour," he said without looking back. Alone in the kitchen, Rosalie sank into one of the chairs and stared at the recipe card still clutched in her hand. Apple cake, such a simple thing, but it represented everything she wasn't and couldn't be. The first wife, the chosen one, the woman who had earned her place in this house through love rather than desperation. She thought of her own mother, dead. These 10 years, and the cameo brooch that was all she had left of that gentlewoman's love. Everyone carried their ghosts, she supposed. The question was whether those ghosts would allow space for the living. Outside, she could hear Calder moving around the barn with more force than necessary, the sharp crack of wood against wood suggesting that he was working through his emotions with physical labor. She'd seen men do that before, her father, her brothers, the harsh guardians who had made her life unbearable after her parents died. But there had been something different in Calder's eyes when he'd found her with Sarah's recipe. Not anger exactly, but fear. The kind of fear that came from having your carefully constructed defenses suddenly breached. Rosalie folded the recipe card carefully and placed it on the table where he would find it. She wouldn't hide from this. Confrontation wouldn't pretend that the morning hadn't revealed the fundamental problem with their arrangement. 2 damaged people didn't automatically heal each other simply by sharing the same roof. When she finally joined him in the barn, Calder was brushing down his horse with mechanical precision, his movements sharp and controlled. "We need to talk," Rosalie said without preamble. "Nothing to talk about." He didn't look up from his work. "There's everything to talk about. We can't live like this, pretending that there aren't ghosts in every room of that house." Calder's hand stilled on the brush. "What would you have me do? Forget 5 years of marriage, like it never happened?" "I'd have you be honest with me," Rosalie replied, "and honest with yourself. You didn't marry me to move forward. You married me to stay exactly where you are, stuck in a grief so deep you can't even see daylight anymore." The words hung in the air between them, brutal in their accuracy. Calder finally looked at her, and she saw the rawness in his expression, the pain he'd been carrying alone for too long. "Maybe," he said finally. "But what about you? What are you running from that made marrying a stranger seem like your best option?" It was Rosalie's turn to look away. Fair question, fairly asked. She touched her mother's cameo brooch, drawing strength from the familiar weight of it against her chest. "My parents died when I was 15, she said quietly. "I went to live with my mother's brother and his wife. They weren't kind people. When I turned 18, they tried to arrange a marriage with a man who would have been worse than they were. The mail order arrangement seemed like freedom compared to that. And now? Now I don't know what this is." She gestured between them, encompassing the barn, the house, the strange marriage they'd entered into. "But I know it won't work if we don't find a way to be honest with each other." Calder set down the brush and leaned against the stall door. The late morning sun slanted through the barn windows, illuminating dust motes that danced between them like tiny spirits. "Sarah died in winter," he said finally. "Lung fever. She was sick for weeks, and I kept thinking she'd get better. She always got better." His voice cracked slightly. "The last thing she said to me was not to let the house die with her, to keep living in it, not just existing." "And have you? Kept living?" "No. I've been existing, waiting maybe, though I couldn't." "Tell you for what?" Rosalie took a step closer, close enough to see the silver threads in his hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years spent squinting into the sun and not enough spent laughing. "I can't be her," she said simply. "I won't even try. But maybe we can find something that's ours, instead of trying to build on the foundation of what you had before." Calder studied her face, seeing past the surface beauty to the strength beneath. This woman had survived things that would have broken weaker people, had traveled across the country to start over with nothing but hope and determination. Maybe Sarah would have liked her. "What are you suggesting?" "That we try again, really try this time, not as strangers making a business arrangement, but as two people who have reasons to build something new together. And if it doesn't work, then at least we'll have been honest about the attempt." Calder felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. The morning sun was climbing higher, promising another clear day, and for the first time in years he found himself looking forward rather than backward. "All right," he said. "We'll try again." Starting with Sarah's recipe box, he hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Starting with Sarah's recipe box. Maybe it's time those recipes were used for their intended purpose." Rosalie smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. Perhaps this marriage of convenience might become something else entirely, given time and patience and the kind of courage it took to let ghosts finally rest. 3 days after their conversation in the barn, Rosalie stood in the kitchen, holding Sarah's recipe box with reverent hands. The morning light streamed through windows she'd cleaned the day before, and the familiar weight of her mother's cameo brooch against her chest gave her courage for what felt like a momentous undertaking. She'd asked Calder's permission the night before, and he'd given it with a nod that suggested he was still working through his own feelings about the decision. Now alone in the kitchen that was slowly becoming her domain, she opened the wooden box and breathed in the faint scent of vanilla and cinnamon that clung to the handwritten cards. The recipes were organized with the same care that marked everything Sarah had touched. Breakfast items in the front, dinner recipes in the middle, desserts and special occasion dishes toward the back. Each card told a story. Notes about adjustments made over time, comments about which hired hands preferred what dishes, gentle reminders about Calder's preferences written in the margins. "Make sure the coffee is strong enough to wake the dead," read one note attached to a breakfast recipe. "C claims weak coffee is a crime against nature." Rosalie found herself smiling as she read through the cards, getting to know the woman who had lived in this house before her through the intimate details of daily life. Sarah had been practical but warm, efficient but generous. The recipes spoke of someone who understood that feeding people was an act of love. She selected a simple beef stew recipe for dinner, noting Sarah's penciled addition, "Double the carrots. C. Pretends he doesn't like them but always eats them first." The observation was so tenderly domestic that Rosalie felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Not jealousy exactly, but a wistful recognition of the deep knowing that came from years of shared meals and careful attention. The morning routine had already begun to establish itself. Calder rose before dawn to tend the animals, returning. For breakfast, as the sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold, Rosalie had learned to have coffee ready and hot, eggs cooked the way he preferred them, and something substantial enough to sustain him through hours of physical labor. This morning, however, she noticed something different in his demeanor as he settled at the table. There was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there the day before, and his usual brief nod of thanks was replaced by a distracted silence. "Everything all right with the stock?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him with her own modest portion. "Stock's fine," Calder replied, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Had a visitor early this morning, though." Before sunup, Rosalie's fork paused halfway to her mouth. In her experience, visitors who came before dawn rarely brought good news. "Frank Morrison, he's got the spread adjacent to our eastern boundary. Says he's been having trouble with cattle going missing. Thinks there might be rustlers working the area." The word rustlers sent a chill through Rosalie. She'd heard stories about cattle thieves, men who moved through the territory like wolves, taking what they wanted and disappearing into the vast wilderness. For a rancher like Calder, whose livelihood depended on his herd, such a threat could mean the difference between survival and ruin. How many head has he lost? Dozen or so over the past month. Could be natural predation, strays wandering off, any number of things. But Frank's been ranching here for 20 years. He knows the difference between normal loss and theft. Calder pushed his eggs around his plate without much appetite. He's organizing the local ranchers to keep watch, maybe coordinate patrols. Asked if I'd join in. "Of course you will." He looked up at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. It could mean being away from the ranch more, especially at night. Long hours riding the boundaries, checking on other people's stock as well as our own. "This is your livelihood," Rosalie said simply. "Our livelihood. You can't protect it by staying home and hoping trouble passes you by." The word "our" hung in the air between them, and Rosalie realized she'd claimed a stake in this place without thinking about it, but it was true. Whatever happened to this ranch would affect her future as well as his. "There's something else," Calder said, his voice carefully neutral. "Frank mentioned that Ben Wheeler's been asking questions around town. About my land, about whether I might be interested in selling. It's Ben Wheeler." Rosalie had heard the name whispered in the general store when she'd gone to town for supplies. A man who'd arrived in the territory a few years back with money from back east and an interest in acquiring large tracts of grazing land. Some said he was building an empire. Others whispered that his methods weren't always honorable. "Are you interested in selling, I mean?" Calder's answer came without hesitation. "No, this land has been in my family for 15 years. My father broke his back clearing it, building the house, establishing the herd. Sarah and I—" He paused, then continued more quietly. "Sarah and I talked about our children growing up. Here, maybe expanding the operation, building something lasting." Rosalie heard the pain in his voice, but also something else. Determination. This wasn't just property to him. It was legacy, hope, the physical manifestation of dreams that death had interrupted but not destroyed. "Then that's settled," she said. "We protect what's ours." After breakfast, Calder showed her more of the ranch operation, explaining the seasonal rhythms that governed their lives. The cattle were scattered across several hundred acres of grassland, hardy animals well suited to the harsh Wyoming winters. The hayfields that would provide winter feed were showing their second growth, green and promising in the autumn sun. Sarah used to help with the books, he said as they walked through the barn, checking equipment and making mental notes about what needed repair before winter. She had a head for numbers, could see patterns in the spending and income that I missed. I'm fair with arithmetic, Rosalie offered. My father taught me to keep accounts for the farm. I'd appreciate that. Been letting things slide since... He gestured vaguely, encompassing the years of neglect that followed his wife's death. They worked together through the morning, Rosalie learning the names and temperaments of the horses, the location of tools and feed supplies, the daily tasks that kept a ranch functioning. She found herself genuinely interested in the work, appreciating the direct connection between effort and result that farm life provided. It was while they were mending a section of fence that she first noticed the rider approaching from the east. Calder had seen him too, and his posture shifted subtly, becoming more alert. "Ben Wheeler," he said quietly. "Speak of the devil." The man who rode up to their fence line was perhaps 50 years old, well dressed in the manner of someone who wanted. To be sure, his prosperity was noticed. His horse was a fine animal, expensive and well cared for, and his saddle bore the kind of silver detailing that served no practical purpose. "Calder," Wheeler said with a broad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good to see you out here working the land, and this must be the new Mrs. Holt I've been hearing about." His gaze lingered on Rosalie with an assessment that made her skin crawl. She'd learned to recognize that look, the way some men evaluated women like livestock, calculating value and vulnerability in equal measure. "Wheeler," Calder acknowledged with a nod that held no warmth. "What brings you out this way?" "Just being neighborly. Thought I'd ride over and congratulate you on your recent marriage. Quite a surprise, everyone getting married so sudden-like." The implication was clear. Wheeler had heard the gossip about their hasty wedding and was fishing for details that might prove useful. Rosalie stepped closer to Calder, a subtle but unmistakable claiming of her position. "We didn't see the point. In a long engagement," she said evenly. "When you know what you want, why wait?" Wheeler's smile became a shade more calculating. "Practical thinking. I respect that in a woman. In fact, I have a proposition that you folks might find interesting. I've been acquiring land in this area, building up a proper cattle operation. I'd be willing to make you a very generous offer for this spread." "Not interested," Calder said flatly. "Now don't be hasty. You haven't even heard my terms yet. I'm talking about enough money to set you both up comfortably anywhere you'd like to go. Maybe somewhere warmer. Easier living for a new bride." Again, his eyes moved to Rosalie with that appraising look. She felt Calder's tension increase beside her and placed her hand lightly on his arm, a gesture of support but also restraint. "Mr. Wheeler," she said with the same calm tone she'd used with difficult customers back when she'd worked in her uncle's store. "I appreciate your interest, but this is our home. We're not looking to go anywhere warmer or easier. Times are changing out here, Mrs. Holt. Small operations like this one are going to find it harder and harder to compete. Rustlers, market fluctuations, weather, so many things that can go wrong for folks who don't have the resources to weather the storms." The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakably a threat. Rosalie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "We'll manage," Calder said, his voice carrying a warning of his own. Wheeler shrugged as if their refusal was merely a minor inconvenience. "Well, the offer stands if you change your minds, and you might want to think about it sooner rather than later. Like I said, times are changing." He touched his hat brim in a mockery of politeness and rode away, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. "Pleasant fellow," Rosalie said dryly, watching his retreating figure. "About as pleasant as a rattlesnake," Calder agreed, "and probably twice as dangerous." They returned to their fence mending, but the easy camaraderie of the morning had been disrupted. Rosalie found herself thinking about Wheeler's words, the casual way he'd implied that their ranch might face difficulties. Combined with the rustling reports, It painted a picture of coordinated pressure designed to force small ranchers into selling. "Calder," she said as they worked, "what if the cattle disappearing and Wheeler's interest in buying land aren't separate issues?" He looked up from the wire he was splicing. "You think he's behind the rustling? I think it would be awfully convenient for him if small ranchers started feeling unsafe, started worrying about their ability to protect their herds." Calder considered this, his hands still working automatically with the familiar tools. "It's possible. Wouldn't be the first time someone used fear as a business tool. What do we do about it? We be careful. We participate in Frank's patrol system, and we don't give Wheeler any reason to think his tactics are working." That evening, as Rosalie prepared Sarah's beef stew recipe, she found herself thinking about the life she was building here. 3 days ago, she'd been a stranger, sleeping in a dead woman's bed, cooking in a kitchen that felt like a shrine. Now she was part of something, a partnership, a shared purpose, a home worth defending. The stew filled the house with rich, savory aromas, and when Calder came in from his evening chores, she saw him pause in the doorway, breathing deeply. "Smells like home," he said quietly. "Sarah's recipe," Rosalie replied, ladling the stew into bowls. "Though I added a bit more pepper. Hope you don't mind." "She would have liked that," Calder said, and for the first time he spoke of his first wife without pain shadowing his voice. Sarah was always trying new things, making improvements. She never could leave well enough alone. They ate in comfortable silence, and Rosalie noticed that he did indeed eat the carrots first, just as Sarah had noted. Some things, she thought, with a smile, were eternal. The evenings had become something unexpected in the Holt household, a time of quiet companionship that neither Calder nor Rosalie had dared to hope for when they'd spoken their hasty vows 3 weeks ago. After the supper dishes were cleared, and the last of the day's chores completed, they found themselves drawn to the sitting room, where the warmth of the fire and the gentle rhythm of shared tasks created an intimacy that surprised them both. Tonight, Rosalie sat in the rocking chair, by the window, mending one of Calder's work shirts, while he occupied himself at the small table in the corner. His hands, so capable with rope and tools, worked with surprising delicacy as he carved a piece of pine, the soft scraping of his knife the only sound besides the occasional pop of the fire. "What are you making?" Rosalie asked, looking up from her needlework to watch the careful way he shaped the wood. Calder paused in his work, seeming almost embarrassed to be caught at such a gentle pursuit. "Just a bird," he said. "A robin. Sarah used to say they were the first sign that winter was truly over." The mention of his first wife no longer brought the sharp tension it once had. In the past weeks, Rosalie had learned to navigate the presence of Sarah's memory with growing confidence, understanding that honoring the past didn't require sacrificing the present. "May I see?" He hesitated, then brought the small carving over to her chair. The wood was smooth and warm from his hands, and even unfinished, she could see the graceful curve of the bird's neck, the suggestion of wings folded at rest. It was beautiful work, detailed and patient. "You're very skilled," she said, running her finger along the carved feathers. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I was a boy. My father taught me during the long winter evenings. Said a man needed something peaceful to do with his hands, something that created rather than just maintained." Rosalie handed the carving back to him, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact sent an unexpected warmth up her arm, and she saw something flicker in Calder's eyes that suggested he'd felt it too. "I'd like to learn," she said, "if you'd be willing to teach me." "It's not really woman's work," he said automatically, then caught himself. "I mean, there's no reason you couldn't learn if you wanted to. I've discovered that the definitions of woman's work and man's work are much more flexible out here than they were back east," Rosalie replied with a smile. "Yesterday I helped you repair that gate hinge, and last week you made biscuits when I was feeling poorly. I think we're already past worrying about convention." Calder returned her smile, settling back into his chair. "Fair point, though I have to say, your biscuits are considerably better than mine." "Practice," Rosalie said, Same as anything else. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, but Rosalie's mind kept returning to the conversation they'd had with Frank Morrison earlier that day. The neighbor had stopped by to report another missing cow and to finalize the patrol schedule that would have the local ranchers taking turns riding the boundaries of their properties. "About these patrols," she said, setting down her mending. "I've been thinking about the timing." Calder looked up from his carving. "What about it?" "All the missing cattle have been reported on nights when the moon was dark or nearly so, and always from the eastern boundaries of properties, the side closest to the main road. You think they're loading the stolen cattle directly onto wagons? It would make sense. Drive them a short distance to the road, load them up, and they're gone before morning. No need to worry about moving a herd across open country where they might be spotted." Calder set down his knife, giving her his full attention. "That's good thinking. Frank was right when he said the losses weren't random, too organized, too clean. And if Ben Wheeler is behind it, he'd know exactly which ranches to target, the ones he's most interested in buying out." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter wasn't far away. Soon, the cattle would need to be brought closer to the ranch buildings, and the vulnerability of scattered herds would become even more pronounced. "I'll mention your theory to Frank tomorrow," Calder said finally. "Might be worth concentrating our patrols on the eastern boundaries during the dark moon phases." "I could help with the patrols," Rosalie offered. "Absolutely not." The sharpness of his response startled them both. Calder ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with something. "I mean," he said more gently, "it could be dangerous. If these are professional thieves, they won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way." "I can shoot," Rosalie said quietly. "My father made sure I knew how to protect myself and the farm when he was away. It's not about your ability. It's about—" He paused, searching for words. "I can't lose someone else to this land, Rosalie." "I won't." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Rosalie felt her heart clench at the fear in his voice, the way his hands had stilled on the wooden bird. "You won't," she said softly, "but you can't protect me by keeping me useless either. This is my home now too, Calder. I need to be able to defend it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing not the delicate woman he'd rescued from the train station, but the survivor who'd made her way across the country alone, who'd agreed to marry a stranger rather than surrender to circumstances beyond her control. "All right," he said finally, "but we start with target practice, and if you're going to ride patrol, it won't be alone." A week later, Rosalie stood in the yard behind the barn, a rifle steady in her hands as she sighted down the barrel at a row of tin cans Calder had set up on the fence posts. Her father had indeed taught her to shoot, but that had been years ago, and her hands were less certain than she'd claimed. "Breathe out slowly," Calder said from behind her, his voice calm and instructional. "Don't hold your breath, just let it out naturally, and squeeze the trigger as your lungs empty." She followed his guidance, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon, the way it wanted to pull slightly to the left. The shot rang out across the prairie, and one of the cans spun off its post with a satisfying clang. "Good," Calder said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. "Try the next one." By the time they'd worked through a full box of ammunition, Rosalie had found her rhythm again. Her shots weren't perfect, but they were consistent, and more importantly, she felt the confidence returning that came from being able to defend herself. "I want to show you something," Calder said as they walked back toward the house. He led her to the barn and pulled a wrapped bundle from behind a stack of feed sacks. Inside the oilcloth was a pistol, smaller than the rifle, but well-maintained and clearly designed for a woman's hand. "This was Sarah's," he said quietly. "She insisted on learning to shoot after we had some trouble with wolves getting into the chicken coop. Said she wouldn't be helpless if I wasn't around." Rosalie accepted the weapon carefully, checking to ensure it wasn't loaded before examining the craftsmanship. It was a beautiful piece, with engraved silver detailing on the grip and barrel. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Sarah would want it used," Calder replied. "She'd want you to be safe." That evening, as they sat by the fire with their respective tasks, Rosalie found herself watching Calder's hands as he worked on the wooden robin. The delicate feather details were taking shape under his patient knife, and she could see that the finished piece would be something truly special. "Tell me about your father," she said, "the one who taught you to carve." Calder's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their careful work. "He was a good man. Came out here when this was still considered the edge of nowhere, staked his claim, and built everything you see with his own hands. He used to say that a man's legacy wasn't in what he accumulated, but in what he created that would outlast him. Is that why you won't sell to Wheeler? The legacy? Partly, but it's more than that now." He looked up from his carving, meeting her eyes across the firelight. "It's about proving that some things can't be bought or stolen, that there are still places where a man's word means something, where you can build a life based on honest work, and treating your neighbors fairly. And if Wheeler doesn't accept no for an answer, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I won't be driven off my own land by fear or threats." Rosalie nodded, understanding. She'd run from threats before, had let fear drive her from one situation into another until she'd ended up on that train station bench with nowhere left to go. But this felt different. This felt like something worth standing and fighting for. "The bird," she said, gesturing to his carving. "What will you do with it when it's finished?" Calder considered the question, turning the small robin in his hands. "I thought I might give it to you," he said, "if you'd like it." The simple offer carried more weight than either of them wanted to acknowledge. It was a gift freely given, a token of growing friendship and respect. It was also, Rosalie realized, the first thing he'd made since Sarah's death that wasn't connected to the memory of his first wife. "I'd like that very much," she said. Outside, the wind continued to rise, carrying with it the scent of approaching weather. Soon the first snows would come, and the easy camaraderie of autumn evenings would give way to the close quarters and long nights of winter. But for now, in the warmth of the firelight, with the soft sound of knife on wood and the gentle rock of her chair, Rosalie felt something she hadn't experienced in years: contentment. The wooden robin was taking shape in Calder's hands, and with it something new was taking shape between them, fragile as carved wood, but real as the fire that warmed them both. The first hard frost came in early October, painting the windows with delicate ice crystals and signaling the approach of the season that would test every bond formed during the gentler months. Rosalie woke to find Calder already gone from the house, the coffee cold in the pot and a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen table, bringing cattle closer. Back by afternoon, she wrapped herself in one of Sarah's old shawls, a liberty she'd finally allowed herself after Calder had explicitly told her to make use of anything that would keep her warm, and stepped onto the porch to survey the transformation that had occurred overnight. The prairie stretched before her, silver and crystalline in the morning light, beautiful but unforgiving. In the weeks since their conversation about the patrols and Ben Wheeler's veiled threats, she and Calder had settled into a partnership that surprised them both with its natural rhythm. They worked together during the day, shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire, and somewhere along the way had begun to anticipate each other's needs with the kind of intuition that usually took years to develop. The wooden robin sat on the mantelpiece now, its carved feathers catching the firelight each evening. Calder had finished it the week before and presented it to her with the shy pride of a schoolboy offering his first Valentine. She'd treasured it not just for its craftsmanship, but for what it represented. The first thing he'd made that looked toward the future rather than mourning the past. This morning, however, the future felt precarious. The frost meant that winter was coming in earnest, and with it all the challenges that the harsh Wyoming climate could bring. Feed would become more expensive, travel more difficult, and the isolated ranch would become even more vulnerable to the kind of troubles that Ben Wheeler seemed determined to encourage. Rosalie made fresh coffee and set about preparing a larger breakfast than usual. If Calder was moving cattle, he'd need substantial food to sustain him through what would likely be a long, cold day in the saddle. She was reaching for Sarah's recipe box when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching from the east. Through the kitchen window, she could see 3 riders coming up the path to the house. One was Calder, but the other 2 were strangers, men whose posture and the way they carried their weapons suggested they weren't paying a social call. She moved quickly to the parlor, where Sarah's pistol was kept in the drawer of the writing desk, checking to ensure it was loaded before tucking it into the pocket of her apron. Then she returned to the kitchen and continued preparing breakfast as if she hadn't a care in the world. The men's voices carried through the morning air as they dismounted, too low for her to make out words, but clear enough to detect the tension in their tones. When Calder finally entered the kitchen, his face was grim, and the 2 strangers who followed him looked like the kind of men who made their living in ways that didn't bear close examination. "Rosalie," Calder said, his voice carefully controlled. "These gentlemen say they're looking for work, cattle work." The taller of the 2 men stepped forward, touching his hat brim with mocking courtesy. "Ma'am, name's Jake Curtis. This here's my partner, Bill Haynes. We heard you might be hiring hands for the winter." Rosalie studied the men with the same careful attention she'd once used to evaluate potentially difficult customers in her uncle's store. Curtis was lean and weathered, with the kind of pale eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. Haynes was broader, with scarred knuckles and a way of standing that suggested he was comfortable with violence. "I'm afraid you heard." "Wrong," she said pleasantly. "We're not hiring anyone." "That's a shame," Curtis replied, his gaze moving around the kitchen with obvious assessment. "Nice place you got here. Lot of work for just 2 people to manage, though. Easy for things to go wrong when you're spread too thin." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Rosalie felt the weight of the pistol in her pocket and found it oddly comforting. "We managed just fine," she said, "but thank you for your concern." "Winter's coming on hard." Haynes spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly with disuse. "Lot of things can happen to isolated folks during the cold months. Cattle can wander off, predators can get bold, accidents happen." Calder's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Rosalie stepped smoothly into the conversation. "You're absolutely right," she said with a bright smile. "That's why we're so grateful to have such good neighbors. Frank Morrison stops by nearly every day, and the sheriff makes regular rounds through this area. Just yesterday, he mentioned how important it was to keep track of any strangers passing through. Said there'd been some trouble with drifters lately. It was a complete fabrication. The sheriff rarely ventured this far from town, and Frank Morrison was too busy with his own ranch to visit daily. But the lie was delivered with such conviction that Curtis and Haynes exchanged a glance that suggested they weren't entirely sure whether to believe her. "Well," Curtis said after a moment, "if you change your mind about needing help, we'll be around the area for a while, working for other folks who appreciate having reliable men on hand." "I'm sure," Rosalie replied. "Safe travels, gentlemen." After the men had gone, Calder stood at the window watching until they were well out of sight before turning to face her. "That was well done," he said, "though I'm not sure it was wise to antagonize them." "I didn't antagonize them. I just made it clear that we're not as isolated and helpless as they might have hoped." Rosalie poured him coffee with hands that were steadier than she felt. "Those weren't men looking for honest work." "No," Calder agreed grimly. "I'd bet my best horse. They're working for Wheeler, testing our defenses, seeing how we react to pressure. What do? We be more careful, and we make sure our neighbors know what's happening." That afternoon, Frank Morrison confirmed their suspicions when he stopped by to check on their morning visitors. "Curtis and Haynes," he said, shaking his head. "They offered their services to me too, couple days back. When I turned them down, they made a point of mentioning how easy it would be for a man my age to have an accident during the winter months." "Did you report it to the sheriff?" Rosalie asked. Frank snorted. "Sheriff Thompson's been bought and paid for by Wheeler since the man came to town. Reporting threats to him would be like asking the fox to guard the hen house. They were sitting around the kitchen table, sharing coffee and the apple cake Rosalie had made, using one of Sarah's recipes. The normalcy of the scene contrasted sharply with the serious nature of their conversation. "So we're on our own," Calder said. "Looks that way, but we're not defenseless." Frank gestured toward the rifle that now hung openly on the kitchen wall. "And there are more of us than there are of them, if it comes to a fight." "Let's hope it doesn't," Rosalie said quietly. That evening, she and Calder worked together on a project that had become their shared winter preparation, mending an old quilt that had belonged to his grandmother. The fabric was still sound, but years of use had loosened some of the stitching, and the careful work of repair required both their hands. "I used to help my mother with quilting when I was small," Rosalie said, her needle moving in small, precise stitches. "She said that mending was more important than making because it meant you valued what you already had." Calder worked beside her, his larger hands surprisingly adept with the delicate task. "Sarah always said the same thing. She used to mend everything, clothes, blankets, even my socks when they got holes. Said it was wasteful to throw away something that could be made useful again." They worked in comfortable silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they reached for different sections of the quilt. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and reminding them of the storm clouds that had been building on the horizon all day. "Calder," Rosalie said softly, "what happened this morning with those men? It frightened me. Not because of the threat itself, but because I realized how much I have to lose now." He looked up from his stitching, meeting her eyes in the firelight. "What do you mean? 3 months ago, I had nothing. No home, no family, no future I could count on. If someone had threatened me then, the worst they could have done was kill me, and honestly there were days when that didn't seem like such a terrible prospect." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But now I have this place, this life we're building together. I have something worth protecting." Calder set down his needle and reached across the space between them to cover her hand with his. The contact was warm and solid, anchoring her to the present moment. "You're not going to lose it," he said quietly. "We're not going to lose it. Whatever Wheeler and his men have planned, we'll face it together. Promise me something," she said, turning, her hands so their palms touched. "Promise me that if things get dangerous, you won't try to protect me by sending me away. This is my fight too now." For a long moment, Calder didn't respond. She could see the conflict in his expression, the desire to keep her safe warring with the recognition that she was right to claim her stake in their shared future. "I promise," he said finally, "but you have to promise me something too." "What?" "That you won't take unnecessary risks, that you'll be smart about when to fight and when to retreat." "I promise." Their hands remained clasped as they returned to their work on the quilt, and Rosalie felt something shift between them, a deepening of the partnership that had been growing since that first awkward morning in Sarah's kitchen. They were no longer two strangers sharing a house out of convenience. They were allies, bound together by shared purpose and the growing understanding that they were stronger together than either could be alone. Outside, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, drifting past the windows like promise and threat combined. Winter was coming, and with it whatever challenges Wheeler and his men had planned. But inside the warm circle of firelight, with the steady rhythm of their needles and the quiet comfort of each other's presence, Rosalie felt ready to face whatever storms lay ahead. The quilt was taking shape under their joint attention, the damaged sections becoming whole again through patient care and careful stitching. Like their marriage, she thought, it was becoming something new while honoring what had come before, a creation born of necessity but sustained by something deeper and more enduring. The bundle of letters hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the upstairs bedroom had been Sarah's secret, and now they had become Rosalie's burden. She'd discovered them by accident while moving furniture to better accommodate the winter drafts, and what she'd found had shaken her understanding of the woman whose shadow she'd been living in for the past 2 months. The letters were tied with a faded blue ribbon, and the handwriting on the envelopes was Sarah's own, but they weren't correspondence she'd received. They were copies of letters she'd written, drafts kept for reasons that became clear as Rosalie read the first few lines of the topmost page. "My dearest sister Margaret," the letter began, "I write this knowing I may never find the courage to send it, but I must put these words somewhere, or I fear I shall go mad with keeping them inside." Rosalie's hands trembled as she continued reading, each word revealing a side of Sarah she'd never imagined. The woman who'd seemed so perfect, so complete in her happiness with Calder, had been desperately homesick for the family she'd left behind in Pennsylvania. More than that, she'd been struggling with feelings of inadequacy, with the harsh realities of frontier life that had worn down her spirit in ways she'd apparently never shared with her husband. "Calder works so hard to make me happy here," one letter revealed, "and I cannot bear to tell him how I miss the sound of church bells on Sunday morning, or how I sometimes cry when I see the endless emptiness of this land stretching to the horizon. He thinks I am strong, and perhaps I am, but there are days when I feel as fragile as the china teacups Mother gave me for my wedding, sitting unused in the cabinet because I'm too afraid they'll break if I actually try to live with them." As she read deeper into the collection, Rosalie discovered that Sarah's final year had been marked by more than just the lung fever that eventually claimed her. She'd suffered a miscarriage the winter before her death, losing a baby that she and Calder had desperately wanted. The grief had nearly broken her, and the letters revealed a woman struggling not just with loss, but with the fear that she was somehow failing as a wife. "I see how Calder looks at other men's children," one particularly heartbreaking letter confessed, "and I know he blames himself for our loss, though he would never say so. He treats me like spun glass now, afraid that too much happiness might shatter what little I have left. But I am not made of glass. I am made of tears and disappointment, and a love so fierce it frightens me. If only I could make him understand that his gentleness, though meant to heal, sometimes feels like a prison of good intentions." Rosalie sank onto the edge of the bed, the letters scattered around her like fallen leaves. This was not the perfect marriage she'd been imagining, the seamless partnership that had made her feel like an inadequate replacement. This was a real marriage between real people who'd struggled with real problems, communication failures, unspoken fears, the weight of expectations that had never been voiced. The sound of boots on the stairs made her quickly gather the letters, but not quickly enough. Calder appeared in the doorway just as she was retying the blue ribbon, and the expression on her face must have told him everything he needed to know. "You found them," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I was moving the chest to block the draft, and the floorboard was loose, and it's all right." He entered the room and sat heavily in the chair by the window. "I wondered where she'd hidden them, found the loose board years ago, but never looked underneath. Did you know about what she was feeling?" Calder was quiet for a long time, staring out at the snow that had been falling steadily for 3 days. Some of it, not all of it. Sarah was... He paused, searching for words. She was proud. Didn't like to admit when things were difficult for her. She lost a baby. Yes, the winter before she died. We never talked about it much afterward. I thought... His voice caught slightly. "I thought she needed space to heal, so I tried to give her that. Maybe I gave her too much space." Rosalie set the letters aside and moved to the window, standing close enough to Calder that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The view from this room encompassed most of their ranch, from the barn and outbuildings to the pastures, where the cattle huddled against the wind. "She loved you," Rosalie said softly. "That comes through in every word. But she was struggling with things she didn't know how to share. And I was too blind to see it." The bitterness in his voice was palpable. "Thought I was being considerate, giving her room to grieve. Instead, I was leaving her alone with her pain. You were both hurting. People don't always make the best choices when they're in pain." Calder looked up at her then, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Is that what we're doing, Rosalie? Making choices based on pain rather than hope? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had been willing to acknowledge. Over the past months, they'd built something together. A partnership, a friendship, a home. But they'd both been careful to maintain the boundaries of their original arrangement, afraid to risk the comfortable stability they'd achieved. Maybe, she admitted, maybe we've been so focused on protecting ourselves from more hurt that we haven't noticed what we might be missing. The snow continued to fall outside, muffling the sounds of the ranch and creating a sense of intimacy in the small bedroom. They'd been alone together countless times over the past months, but this felt different, charged with a possibility that had been building slowly, like water behind a dam. "Tell me about your marriage," Calder said suddenly. "The one you ran." From back east, Rosalie felt her stomach clench. This was the conversation she'd been dreading, the revelation that would either drive them apart or bring them closer together. "It wasn't a marriage," she said quietly. "It was a business transaction arranged by my uncle after my parents died. The man, Harold Crane, was 40 years older than me and had a reputation for not being kind to his wives. His first 2 wives died under suspicious circumstances." Calder's hands clenched in his lap. "Your uncle knew this." "My uncle owed Crane money, a lot of money. The marriage would have settled the debt and gotten me off his hands at the same time." She wrapped her arms around herself, remembering the fear that had driven her desperate escape. "I tried to refuse, but my uncle made it clear that I didn't have a choice. So I took what little money I could steal from his store and bought a train ticket west, hoping I could disappear before the wedding. But you ended up as a mail-order bride anyway. It seemed safer. A correspondence marriage to a stranger felt less threatening than being sold to a man who might kill me." She laughed bitterly. "Though I suppose it amounted to the same thing in the end, marrying a stranger for security." "No," Calder said firmly, rising from his chair to face her. "It's not the same thing at all. You chose to respond to Harold Pemberton's advertisement. You chose to come west, and when that didn't work out, you chose to accept my proposal rather than give up. Those were your decisions, made from strength, not fear. Was your proposal made from strength or fear?" The question caught him off guard, and she saw him struggle with the honesty she'd shown him. "Fear, probably," he admitted. "Fear of being alone forever, fear of watching you face the same kind of judgment and gossip that would have destroyed you in this town. But also," he paused, then continued more quietly, "also from something that felt like recognition, like I'd been waiting for you without knowing it." The admission hung between them like a bridge, fragile but real. Rosalie felt her heart racing as she stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of green in his brown eyes. "Calder," she said softly, "what are we to each other?" "I don't know," he replied honestly. "But I know it's more than what we started with." The first kiss happened slowly, tentatively, like 2 people afraid of breaking something precious. His hands came up to frame her face, and she could feel the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "Are we making a mistake?" Rosalie asked. "Probably," Calder said with a rueful smile. "But maybe it's time we made some mistakes based on hope instead of fear." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small bedroom, where they'd finally acknowledged what had been growing between them, the world felt warm and full of possibility. They stood together at the window, watching the snow transform the familiar landscape into something new and beautiful, and Rosalie thought about Sarah's letters, about the importance of speaking difficult truths before it was too late. "No more secrets between us," she said, her hand finding his. "No more protecting each other from our own feelings." "No more secrets," Calder agreed, bringing her hand to his lips. "Though I should warn you, my feelings are getting considerably more complicated by the day." "Good," Rosalie said, surprising them both with her boldness. "I'd hate to be the only one losing sleep over this." They stayed at the window until the light began to fade, talking quietly about the future they might build together, about the difference between a marriage of convenience and a marriage of choice. When they finally went downstairs to prepare dinner together, the easy companionship they'd developed over the past months had deepened into something richer and more complex. The letters remained upstairs, Sarah's secrets finally shared and no longer carrying the weight of hidden sorrow. Tomorrow, Calder would tell Rosalie more about the baby they'd lost, about his own fears and failures during Sarah's final year. Tonight, they would sit by the fire and work on their quilt, but their hands would brush more often than necessary, and their conversation would carry the new intimacy of people who had finally admitted they were falling in love. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, but neither of them minded being snowed in together. For the first time since their hasty wedding, they had nowhere else they'd rather be. The forged document arrived on a Tuesday morning in early November, delivered by a man who claimed to be a territorial marshal, but whose badge looked suspiciously new and whose manner suggested he was more comfortable with threats than with law enforcement. Rosalie accepted the official-looking papers with a steady hand, though her heart was racing as she recognized the name at the bottom of the legal summons: Harold Crane, her uncle's business partner, the man she'd been promised to in marriage and from whom she'd fled in terror just 6 months ago. "Mrs. Holt," the false marshal said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "I trust you'll give these documents the attention they deserve. Mr. Crane has been very patient about recovering his property, but his patience has limits, I'm afraid." "I don't understand," Rosalie replied, though she understood perfectly. "What property would Mr. Crane believe I possess?" "According to these legal papers, you stole a considerable sum of money from your uncle's store before your departure. Mr. Crane, as your uncle's business partner, has the right to recover that debt, plus interest and damages." The document was an impressive forgery, complete with official seals and legal language that would intimidate anyone unfamiliar with the law. It claimed that Rosalie had embezzled nearly $300 from her uncle's general store and that her flight west constituted an admission of guilt. "This is absurd," Rosalie said, but even as she spoke she realized the cleverness of the scheme. Even if the document was eventually proven false, the mere accusation would be enough to destroy her reputation and provide legal justification for taking her back east. "Mr. Crane is prepared to be reasonable," the false marshal continued. "He's willing to forgive the debt in exchange for your return to Pennsylvania to fulfill the marriage contract that was interrupted by your sudden departure." The threat was clear, and Rosalie felt the familiar terror that had driven her west in the first place. But this time she wasn't alone and defenseless. This time she had something worth fighting for. "I'll need to discuss this with my husband," she said calmly. "Of course, but don't take too long to decide. Mr. Crane has invested considerable resources in tracking you down, and he expects a return on that investment." After the man left, Rosalie sat at the kitchen table, staring at the forged papers, her mind racing through the implications. Crane had found her, just as she'd always feared he would. Worse, he'd found a way to make his claim on her appear legal and legitimate. When Calder returned from the morning chores, he found her still sitting motionless at the table, the documents spread before her like evidence of a crime. "What's this?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Rosalie explained about the visitor and the accusations, watching Calder's expression grow darker with each word. When she finished, he picked up the papers and examined them with the careful attention of a man who'd had occasion to review legal documents before. "It's well done," he said finally, "but it's still a forgery. How can you tell?" "The territorial seal is wrong. The design changed last year, but whoever made this used the old version, and the judge's signature." He pointed to a flourish at the bottom of the page. "Judge Harrison died 3 months ago. This document is supposedly dated last week." Relief flooded through Rosalie, but it was short-lived. "Even if we can prove it's forged, Crane has obviously invested serious money in this scheme. He won't give up easily." "Tell me about this marriage contract he mentioned." Rosalie felt her cheeks burn with shame. It wasn't really a contract, just an agreement between my uncle and Crane. My uncle owed gambling debts, and Crane offered to forgive them in exchange for me. And you never signed anything? I was never asked to sign anything. Women rarely are in arrangements like that. Calder set the papers aside and took her hands in his. Listen to me carefully, Rosalie. You are legally married to me now. No previous arrangement, contract, or agreement can change that. Crane has no claim on you whatsoever, but if he has enough money to forge official documents, to hire men to pose as marshals, then we'll deal with it. Together. That afternoon, Frank Morrison arrived with news that explained much about the morning's visit. 3 of his cattle had been found slaughtered in the far pasture, not killed for meat, but apparently killed to send a message. Ben Wheeler paid me a visit this morning, Frank said, accepting the coffee Rosalie offered. Made a very generous offer for my land. When I refused, he mentioned that it was dangerous times for small ranchers. Said accidents could happen to anyone. The same day Rosalie gets a visit from a fake marshal, Calder mused. That's not coincidence. What fake marshal? Calder explained about the forged documents and the threat against Rosalie. As he spoke, Frank's expression grew increasingly grim. So Wheeler's found a way to pressure both of us at the same time, Frank said. Threaten your wife with arrest and deportation while making it clear that refusing to sell could result in more direct action. There's something else, Rosalie said quietly. The man who came here this morning. I've seen him before. He was one of Wheeler's hired men, the ones who came looking for work a few weeks back. Curtis, Calder said grimly. I should have recognized him. So what do we do? Frank asked. Before Calder could answer, they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Through the kitchen window they could see Ben Wheeler himself riding up to the house, accompanied by Curtis and 2 other men. Speak of the devil, Frank muttered. Wheeler dismounted with the confidence of a man who believed. He held all the advantages. His clothes were expensive but practical, and his manner suggested someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money and intimidation. Afternoon, folks, he said as Calder opened the door. Mind if I come in? I believe we have some business to discuss. State your business from there, Calder replied coldly. Wheeler's smile never wavered. Now, that's not very neighborly, especially considering the generous offer I'm about to make. We've already told you we're not interested in selling. Circumstances change, Wheeler said, his gaze moving to Rosalie. I understand Mrs. Holt has had some legal troubles come to light. Terrible thing when a person's past catches up with them. The only thing terrible here is your attempt at extortion, Rosalie said, stepping into view beside her husband. Extortion is a strong word, ma'am. I prefer to think of it as motivation. You see, I've been contracted by certain parties back east to assist in resolving some outstanding legal matters. It just so happens that those same legal matters create a situation where selling your ranch might be the most practical solution for everyone involved. And if we refuse, Calder asked, well then, I'd be obligated to assist the proper authorities in ensuring that justice is served. Mrs. Holt would need to return east to face the charges against her, and you'd be left here alone, trying to manage a ranch while defending your wife against some very serious accusations. The threat was delivered with casual confidence, as if Wheeler truly believed he'd created an unwinnable situation. What he hadn't counted on was the bond that had formed between Calder and Rosalie, or their willingness to fight for what they'd built together. Mr. Wheeler, Rosalie said with icy calm, I'm afraid your Eastern associates have misinformed you about the strength of their legal position. Is that so? Calder stepped forward, the forged documents in his hand. These papers are forgeries, Wheeler, and not very good ones. Any real law enforcement officer would spot the problems immediately. For the first time, Wheeler's confidence seemed to waver slightly. Those are serious accusations, Mr. Holt, not accusations. Facts. The territorial seal is outdated, and the signature belongs to a judge who's been dead for 3 months. Whoever you paid to create these documents cheated you. Wheeler's expression hardened. Even if that were true, it doesn't change the fundamental situation. Mrs. Holt still has obligations. Back east, Mrs. Holt's only obligation is to her husband and her home here, Frank Morrison said, rising from his chair, and she's got plenty of friends who'll see that those obligations are respected. Wheeler looked around the kitchen, clearly reassessing the situation. He'd expected to find two isolated, frightened people easy to intimidate. Instead, he'd found a united front backed by community support. "This isn't over," he said finally. "There are other ways to resolve disputes between neighbors." "Yes, there are," Calder agreed. "Legal ways, honest ways, methods that don't involve forged documents and hired thugs." After Wheeler and his men left, the three friends sat in the kitchen discussing their options. The forged documents had been exposed, but Wheeler's threat remained real. A man with enough resources to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme wouldn't give up easily. "He'll try something else," Frank predicted. "Maybe more direct action against the ranch, or he might bring in someone with real legal authority who can be bought. Then we need to be ready," Calder said, "and we need to make sure the real authorities know what's happening here." That evening, as they prepared for bed, Rosalie found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been a terrified young woman fleeing an arranged marriage. Now she was a ranch wife with a husband who loved her and friends willing to stand beside her against whatever threats emerged. "Are you sorry?" she asked Calder as they stood together in the kitchen, banking the fire for the night. "Sorry you got involved in my troubles? The only thing I'm sorry about," Calder replied, pulling her into his arms, "is that it took us so long to admit we love each other." It was the first time either of them had spoken the word aloud, and it hung in the air between them like a promise. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows and reminded them that winter, and whatever challenges Wheeler had planned, was coming whether they were ready or not. But inside the warm circle of their embrace, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, they felt ready to face whatever storms lay ahead. They had found something worth fighting for, and they would fight for it together. Calder's father's rifle had seen him through 2 decades of frontier life, from his first hunting expedition as a 12-year-old boy to the hard years of establishing the ranch, when wolves and rustlers posed equal threats to a man's livelihood. Now, as he cleaned and checked the weapon by lamplight in the kitchen, Rosalie watched him perform the familiar ritual with the kind of reverence other men reserved for prayer. "Tomorrow, we ride to Millbrook," he said, without looking up from his work. "Frank's already sent word to the other ranchers, and we've got a meeting with the territorial judge who's coming through on his circuit." It had been 3 days since Wheeler's visit and his thinly veiled threats. 3 days of careful planning, sending messages to allies, and preparing for what everyone understood would be the final confrontation. Wheeler had overplayed his hand with the forged documents, but men like him rarely retreated when their first strategy failed. They simply escalated to more direct methods. "Judge Patterson will want to see the forged papers," Rosalie said, checking the loads in Sarah's pistol with the same methodical care. Calder showed his rifle. "And we'll need witnesses to Wheeler's threats. Frank's bringing Tom Bradley and Jim Hutchins. Between the 4 of us, we should be able to present a clear picture of what Wheeler's been doing." Calder set the rifle aside and looked at her seriously. "But you understand what this means, don't you? Once we formally accuse Wheeler of forgery and extortion, there's no going back. He'll see it as a declaration of war." "Good," Rosalie replied, with a fierceness that surprised them both. "I'm tired of running from bullies and cowards. It's time to make a stand." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry for miles across the prairie. They loaded their wagon before sunrise, taking not only their weapons and legal documents, but also 3 days' worth of supplies. None of them expected Wheeler to simply accept a legal defeat and retreat quietly. Frank Morrison met them at the crossroads that marked the halfway point to town. His own wagon carrying Tom Bradley and Jim Hutchins along with enough ammunition to outfit a small army. The older rancher's face was grim as he surveyed their preparations. "Spotted smoke from Wheeler's line shack early this morning," he reported. "Looks like he's got at least a dozen men camped up there, and they're not acting like ordinary ranch hands." "Hired guns," Tom Bradley spat. He was a man in his 60s who'd been fighting various forms of frontier lawlessness for most of his adult life. Should have expected as much. Wheeler's type doesn't like to lose, and they're not particular about how they win. The ride to Millbrook took most of the morning, and they used the time to refine their strategy. Judge Patterson was known to be honest but cautious, reluctant to take action without overwhelming evidence. They would need to present their case carefully, making it clear that Wheeler's activities threatened not just individual ranchers, but the rule of law itself. "The key is connecting the rustling to the pressure to sell," Jim Hutchins said. He was the youngest of the group besides Calder, but his analytical mind had proven valuable in previous disputes. "If we can show a pattern, cattle disappearing from ranches Wheeler wants to buy, followed by generous offers to purchase at reduced prices, then the judge will have to take action." Millbrook was bustling with unusual activity when they arrived. Judge Patterson's circuit court sessions always drew people from across the territory, but today's crowd seemed larger and more agitated than usual. As they made their way toward the courthouse, Rosalie noticed several men she didn't recognize loitering near the saloon, their attention focused on the legal proceedings rather than the usual attractions of drinking and gambling. "Wheeler's watchers," Calder murmured, following her gaze. "He knows we're here." Judge Patterson proved to be a thin, scholarly man in his 50s, with the kind of sharp eyes that suggested he'd heard every possible variation of frontier justice and legal manipulation during his years on the bench. He examined the forged documents with professional interest, asking detailed questions about their delivery and the man who'd presented them. "These are certainly sophisticated forgeries," he admitted after several minutes of careful study. "The legal language is correct. The seals are convincing to a layman, and the formatting follows proper territorial procedures. Someone invested considerable time and money in creating these." "But they are forgeries," Rosalie asked. "Unquestionably. The discrepancies your husband noted are only the most obvious problems. The case number doesn't match any territorial records. The supposed court dates fall on days when that particular court wasn't in session, and the charges described aren't properly filed under territorial statutes." Frank Morrison stepped forward with the documentation they'd prepared regarding the cattle rustling. "Judge, we believe these forged papers are part of a larger scheme to force small ranchers to sell their land under duress." Patterson listened carefully as they laid out their evidence, the pattern of missing cattle, the timing of Wheeler's purchase offers, the intimidation tactics used by his hired men. When they finished, the judge sat quietly for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of their accusations. "Mr. Wheeler is a prominent citizen with significant business interests," he said finally. "These are serious charges you're bringing against him." "Yes, sir, they are," Calder replied, "but the evidence speaks for itself. Evidence of cattle rustling, yes. Evidence of intimidation tactics, possibly. But proving that Mr. Wheeler is directly responsible for a coordinated scheme." Patterson shook his head. "That would require more than circumstantial connections." "What would it take?" Rosalie asked. "Direct testimony from someone involved in the scheme, documents in Wheeler's own hand, evidence that he personally directed illegal activities." The judge looked at them seriously. "The kind of evidence that men like Wheeler are very careful not to leave lying around." They left the courthouse with a mixed sense of victory and frustration. The forged documents had been officially declared fraudulent, which meant Rosalie could no longer be threatened with false legal proceedings. But Wheeler remained free to continue his other activities, and nothing they'd presented would justify arresting him or his hired men. "At least we've got official protection now," Frank said as they prepared to return to their ranches. "If Wheeler tries any more legal tricks, Patterson knows what to look for." Legal tricks weren't what I was worried about, Tom Bradley replied grimly. Men like Wheeler don't stop at forgery when it doesn't work. They move on to more direct methods. As if summoned by his words, Ben Wheeler himself appeared on the courthouse steps, flanked by Curtis and 3 other men Rosalie didn't recognize. His expensive clothes and confident bearing made him stand out among the rough frontier crowd, but there was something predatory in his manner that sent a chill down her spine. "Mr. Holt, Mrs. Holt," Wheeler called out with false geniality. "I trust your business with Judge Patterson went well?" "Well enough," Calder replied carefully. "Excellent. I do hope you understand that certain legal misunderstandings don't change the fundamental economic realities of your situation." Wheeler's smile was cold and calculating. "Cattle prices are falling, winter feed is expensive, and accidents have a way of happening to isolated ranches during the harsh months." "Is that a threat, Mr. Wheeler?" Judge Patterson's voice carried clearly from the courthouse entrance, where he'd apparently been listening to the exchange. "Merely an observation about the challenges of frontier life, Your Honor," Wheeler replied smoothly. "I'm sure these good people understand the risks they face. I'm sure they do. And I'm equally sure they understand their legal rights and the protections available to them under territorial law." Wheeler's expression tightened slightly, but his tone remained pleasant. "Of course, Judge. Law and order are the foundations of civilization." After Wheeler and his men departed, Judge Patterson approached their group with obvious concern. "I want you all to be very careful over the next few weeks," he said quietly. "Men like Wheeler don't appreciate having their plans disrupted, and they're not always particular about staying within legal boundaries when they feel cornered." "What are you suggesting, Judge?" Frank asked. "I'm suggesting that you watch your backs, vary your routines, and don't travel alone if you can avoid it. And if anything suspicious happens, anything at all, send word to me immediately." The ride back to the ranch was conducted in thoughtful silence, each of them processing the day's events and their implications. They'd won a legal victory, but at the cost of forcing Wheeler into a position where he might feel compelled to take more drastic action. As they approached the crossroads, where Frank would turn toward his own spread, Rosalie found herself thinking about the life she and Calder had built together over the past months. The quiet evenings by the fire, the shared work that had brought them closer, the growing love that had transformed their marriage of convenience into something precious and real. "Whatever happens," she said to Calder as they continued toward home alone, "I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. Not the hasty wedding, not the threats, not even Wheeler's schemes. If I had to choose again, I'd still choose you, still choose this life." Calder reached across the wagon seat to take her hand. "Even knowing what we might be facing, especially knowing what we might be facing. 3 months ago, I had nothing worth fighting for. Now I have everything worth fighting for." That evening they made their preparations with the methodical care of people who understood they might be facing a siege. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, extra ammunition was distributed around the house, and they established signals with Frank Morrison that would allow them to call for help if needed. As they worked, Rosalie found herself thinking about the wooden robin that sat on their mantelpiece, the symbol of hope and new beginnings that Calder had carved during their early days together. Tomorrow might bring violence, loss, or worse, but tonight, in the warm circle of their shared determination, she felt ready to face whatever storms lay ahead. They had found something worth fighting for, and by God, they were going to fight for it with everything they had. The wedding certificate lay spread on the kitchen table like a battle standard, its formal language and official seals representing everything that Wheeler and his hired men couldn't buy, forge, or steal. Rosalie touched the document gently, remembering the nervous young woman who had signed her new name in Reverend Morrison's parlor just 4 months ago, never imagining that this simple piece of paper would become the legal foundation for defending everything she'd come to love. "They're coming," Calder said from his position at the front window, his father's rifle steady in his hands. 6 riders from the east, moving slow and deliberate, wheelers with them. Dawn was breaking over the Wyoming prairie, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Instead, the approaching riders cast long shadows that seemed to reach toward the ranch house like grasping fingers. Rosalie checked Sarah's pistol one final time, then moved to the window on the opposite side of the kitchen. The position gave her a clear view of the barn and the path that led to the back of the house, the route any smart attackers would use to avoid the obvious approach from the front. "Remember," Calder said quietly, "this isn't about the ranch anymore. It's not even about the money. Wheeler's made this personal, and men like him don't stop until they win or they're stopped." The sound of horses grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of harness and the low murmur of voices. Through the frost-covered glass, Rosalie could see Wheeler's expensive coat and confident posture as he directed his men into position around the house. A loud knock echoed through the morning air, followed by Wheeler's voice calling out with false authority. "Calder Holt, Mrs. Holt, I'm here with Territorial Marshal Jake Curtis to serve legal papers and conduct official business. Open this door immediately." "Curtis again," Calder muttered. "Still playing Marshal, even after we proved his papers were forged." "Mr. Wheeler," Rosalie called back, her voice carrying clearly through the closed door, "we've already established that your legal papers are fraudulent, and Mr. Curtis has no more authority than any other hired gun. State your real business, or leave our property." "Mrs. Holt, you're interfering with the execution of legal warrants. That's a federal crime. Show me a real warrant signed by a real judge, and I'll consider cooperating. Until then, you're trespassing on private property." The silence that followed was ominous. Wheeler had come prepared for intimidation and legal manipulation, but not for informed resistance, backed by legitimate authority. His next move would likely be more direct. "Calder," Wheeler's tone had shifted, dropping the pretense of legal procedure. "You've got 5 minutes to convince your wife to be reasonable. After that, we'll be forced to take action to protect our legal interests." "The only legal interest here is our right to be left alone on our own land," Calder replied. "And we've got Judge Patterson's official ruling to back that up." Through her window, Rosalie saw 2 of Wheeler's men dismounting and moving toward the barn. They weren't acting like law enforcement officers serving warrants. They were positioning themselves like soldiers preparing for an assault. 2 men heading for the barn, she reported quietly. "They're carrying more than sidearms." Calder nodded grimly. The barn contained most of their winter feed, their breeding stock, and the equipment they'd need to survive until spring. If Wheeler's men fired it, they'd be facing ruin, even if they survived the immediate confrontation. "Mrs. Holt," a new voice called from outside. Curtis, trying to sound official. "As a territorial marshal, I'm ordering you to surrender yourself for transport back to Pennsylvania to face charges of theft and fraud." "As a citizen of Wyoming Territory," Rosalie replied firmly, "I'm ordering you to stop impersonating a federal officer and leave my property before I file charges against you for fraud, intimidation, and trespassing." The wedding certificate on the table caught the morning light, and Rosalie felt a surge of fierce pride in what it represented. She was no longer the frightened young woman who'd fled her uncle's house in the middle of the night. She was Rosalie Holt, wife to a good man, partner in a thriving ranch, and defender of the life they'd built together. "Time's up," Wheeler announced. "Curtis, execute your warrant." The front door shuddered under a heavy blow, someone trying to break it down with an axe or sledgehammer. At the same time, Rosalie saw smoke beginning to rise from the direction of the barn. "They're firing the barn," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Sons of bitches," Calder swore. "All right, this ends now." He moved to the kitchen door and threw it open, his rifle coming up to his shoulder in one smooth motion. "Wheeler, call off your men, or someone's going to get hurt. The only people getting hurt will be those who resist lawful authority." Wheeler replied, but his voice carried less confidence than it had earlier. The sound of approaching horses from the west made everyone freeze. Through the morning air came the thunder of multiple riders moving fast, and Wheeler's men began looking nervously in that direction. "Looks like the cavalry's arrived," Calder said with grim satisfaction. Frank Morrison led the charge, followed by Tom Bradley, Jim Hutchins, and 6 other ranchers who'd answered the call for help. They rode hard and purposeful, spreading out to surround Wheeler's position with the practiced efficiency of men who'd fought this kind of battle before. "Wheeler!" Frank's voice carried clearly across the yard. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Call off your men and ride out while you still can." For a moment, the tableau held. Wheeler's hired guns caught between the house they'd been attacking and the armed ranchers who'd cut off their escape route. Smoke continued to rise from the barn, but the assault on the front door had stopped. "This is still a legal matter," Wheeler tried one last time. "These people are interfering with the execution of federal warrants." "These warrants." Judge Patterson's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Every head turned to see the territorial judge riding up from the south, accompanied by the real territorial marshal and 3 deputies. Patterson held a set of papers in his hand, the forged documents that Wheeler had tried to use against Rosalie. "I've had these documents examined by federal authorities in Cheyenne," Patterson announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute legal authority. "They're not just forgeries. They're federal crimes. Mr. Wheeler, you and your associates are under arrest for mail fraud, impersonating federal officers, and conspiracy to commit extortion." The fight went out of Wheeler's men like air from a punctured balloon. Faced with real law enforcement and overwhelming odds, they began laying down their weapons and raising their hands. Wheeler himself stood frozen for a moment, clearly struggling to accept that his carefully constructed scheme had collapsed so completely. Then, with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, he reached for the pistol at his side. "Look out!" Rosalie shouted. The shot rang out across the prairie, but it came from Calder's rifle, not Wheeler's pistol. The would-be land grabber spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, his weapon spinning away into the snow. "Should have taken the judge's offer while you had the chance," Calder said coldly, working the bolt of his rifle to chamber another round. The real marshal and his deputies moved in quickly to secure the scene, applying handcuffs to Wheeler and his men, while Judge Patterson began the official process of documenting the crimes that had been committed. "Mrs. Holt," Patterson said as the immediate danger passed, "I believe these belong to you." He handed her the forged papers, along with an official document declaring them fraudulent and void. "There will be no further legal challenges to your status or your marriage. Mr. Wheeler's associates back east will be facing federal charges of their own." Rosalie accepted the papers with hands that were steadier than she felt. "Thank you, Judge, for everything." "Justice isn't just about courtrooms and legal procedures," Patterson replied. "Sometimes it requires good people to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." The smoke from the barn had been controlled by Frank Morrison and his men. The fire had been set, but caught quickly enough to prevent serious damage. As Wheeler and his hired guns were loaded into wagons for transport to the territorial prison, Rosalie found herself standing in the yard of her home, surrounded by friends and neighbors who'd risked their own safety to defend her and Calder. "Is it over?" she asked, not quite daring to believe that the threat that had haunted her for so long was finally ended. "It's over," Calder confirmed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Wheeler's going to prison. The forged papers are worthless, and your uncle's threats can't reach you here." The wedding certificate was still on the kitchen table when they returned to the house, but now it seemed less like a legal defense and more like what it had always been, a symbol of the choice they'd made to build a life together and the commitment that had carried them through every challenge. As the neighbors began to disperse and the immediate crisis faded into memory, Rosalie touched the document one more time and smiled. She was Rosalie Holt, and she was finally, truly home. The handful of Wyoming soil felt warm in Rosalie's palm. Despite the November chill, its rich black earth mixed with the kind of stubborn determination that had allowed countless generations of prairie grass to sink roots deep enough to survive. The harshest winters. Calder had scooped it from the patch of ground where they'd first spoken of expanding the vegetable garden come spring, and now he pressed it into her hands like a promise made tangible. "This is what we fought for," he said, quietly, his voice still rough from the morning's confrontation. "Not just the land, but what it represents. The right to build something lasting, something that belongs to us." Around them, the evidence of Wheeler's defeat was being methodically removed. The territorial marshal had completed his arrests, the forged documents had been officially voided, and the last of the hired guns were disappearing over the eastern horizon in the custody of federal deputies. Frank Morrison and the other neighbors were checking the barn for fire damage, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of men who'd stood together when it mattered most. "I've never owned land before," Rosalie said, letting the soil run through, her fingers like a prayer of gratitude. "My father rented his farm, and after he died I had nothing. This feeling, knowing that this ground, this house, this life is ours, I didn't know it could feel so solid." The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the frost and revealing the fundamental beauty of the landscape they'd fought to protect. The rolling hills stretched toward the mountains in waves of gold and brown, marked here and there by the dark lines of creek beds and the distant figures of cattle moving slowly across the grassland. "There's something I need to tell you," Calder said, his hand covering hers as she held the precious earth. "Something I should have said months ago, but I was too afraid of losing what we'd built together." Rosalie looked up at him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart quicken. The crisis had stripped away all pretense between them, leaving only the raw truth of what they'd become to each other. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because you needed rescuing, not because I was lonely, but because you're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. Because you took a marriage of convenience and turned it into something real through sheer force of will and kindness." "Calder, let me finish," he said gently. "When I married you, I thought I was doing a good deed for a woman in need. I had no idea I was actually saving myself. These past months, watching you bring life back to this house, seeing you face down threats that would have broken lesser people, learning to love the sound of your voice and the way you hum while you cook, I realized that I hadn't really been living since Sarah died. I'd been existing, going through the motions, but not really alive." The soil in Rosalie's hand seemed to pulse with warmth, connecting her to the land and the man who'd offered her both sanctuary and love. Around them, the work of securing their victory continued, but in this moment, they existed in a bubble of perfect understanding. "I love you too," she said, the words coming out in a rush of emotion. "I think I started falling in love with you that first morning when you found me with Sarah's recipe box, and instead of being angry, you chose to trust me with her memory. Every day since then, I've loved you a little more. Your gentleness with the animals, your patience when I was learning ranch work, the way you carved that wooden robin just to give me something beautiful." The kiss that followed was different from their first tentative exploration of attraction. This was a claiming, a celebration, a seal on promises that had been tested by fire and found unbreakable. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "Mrs. Holt," Calder said with a smile that transformed his weathered features, "I believe we have a ranch to run." "Mr. Holt," she replied, matching his grin, "I believe you're absolutely right." The barn, when they inspected it with Frank Morrison, had suffered only minor damage. Wheeler's men had started a fire in the hayloft, but Frank and his neighbors had caught it quickly enough to prevent serious loss. Most of their winter feed was intact, and the livestock had been unharmed. "Could have been a lot worse," Frank observed, kicking at the charred timbers that marked where the fire had started. "If they'd had a few more minutes, you'd have lost everything stored in here." "How did you know to come when you did?" Rosalie asked. Tom Bradley was keeping watch from his ridge. Saw Wheeler's riders heading this way before dawn and sent his boy to round up the rest of us. Frank's expression was serious. We all knew this was coming, just didn't know when. Wheeler's type doesn't give up easy, and they don't forgive folks who stand up to them. Will there be more trouble? Calder asked. Not from Wheeler. Federal prison has a way of cooling down ambitious men, but there are always others looking to make easy money off other people's hard work. Frank clapped Calder on the shoulder. Good thing you've got neighbors who understand the value of sticking together. As the day progressed and the last of the helpers departed, Calder and Rosalie found themselves alone on their land for the first time since the crisis began. The house felt different somehow, not just safer but more completely theirs. The shadows that had lingered from Sarah's memory and Rosalie's uncertain past had been burned away in the fire of shared struggle. That evening, as they sat by the fire working on their quilt, Rosalie found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate woman with no choices and no future. Now she was part of something larger than herself. A marriage, a community, a way of life that demanded courage but rewarded it with belonging. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Harold Pemberton hadn't died? She asked, her needle moving in steady stitches along the quilt's border. No, Calder replied without hesitation. Because then you wouldn't be here, and I can't imagine this life without you in it anymore. Even with all the trouble I brought with me. Especially because of the trouble. Anyone can love someone when it's easy. The real test is whether you'll stand together when things get difficult. He looked up from his own stitching to meet her eyes. We passed that test today. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the promise of the first real snowstorm of the season. But inside their warm kitchen, with the quilt taking shape under their joint attention and the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed words to understand each other, the approaching winter felt less like a threat than a cozy invitation. To spend the long months growing even closer. Calder, Rosalie said as they prepared to bank the fire for the night. There's something I want to ask you. Anything. When spring comes, I'd like to plant a garden where Wheeler's men trampled. The ground by the barn. Something beautiful to cover the ugly memories. What kind of garden? Vegetables mostly, but also flowers. Sarah's favorites if you remember them, and some new ones we choose together. She paused, then continued with the kind of tentative hope that comes after surviving something terrible. And maybe we could expand the house a little, add a room that would be good for... She let the sentence trail off, suddenly shy. For children. Calder finished gently. Someday, if we're blessed. With them. Calder set down the poker he'd been using to arrange the coals and drew her into his arms. I can't think of anything I'd like more than to watch you plant flowers in our garden and rock our babies to sleep in a house we built together as they climbed the stairs to the bedroom they would share for the first time as husband and wife in truth, as well as law. Rosalie felt the weight of the day's earth still clinging to her palm. Tomorrow she would wash it away, but tonight it served as a reminder of everything they'd fought for and won. They had claimed this land not through violence or deception, but through love, courage, and the determination to build something worthy of the sacrifice it had required. And as the first snowflakes began to fall outside their window, covering the battleground of the morning in pristine white, they knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, rooted as deeply in this Wyoming soil as the prairie grass that had weathered countless storms and always returned with the spring. The family portrait captured more than just 3 faces arranged around the photographer's formal backdrop at Millbrook's annual Harvest Festival. It captured the transformation that a single year can bring when 2 people choose love over fear and community over isolation. Calder's hand rested protectively on Rosalie's shoulder while she cradled their 3-month-old daughter, Sarah Rose, in her arms. But surrounding them in the frame were the faces of the neighbors who had become family. Frank Morrison grinning, with paternal pride, Tom Bradley and Jim Hutchins flanking the couple like honorary uncles, and even Judge Patterson, who had made a special trip from Cheyenne to see the child whose parents he'd helped protect. "Hold still now," the photographer instructed, his head disappearing under the black cloth that covered his camera. "This will just take a moment." Rosalie smiled down at the baby in her arms, marveling at how perfectly Sarah Rose fit into the space her heart had prepared without her even knowing it. The child had Calder's dark hair and stubborn chin, but her eyes were the same green as her mother's, and already she showed signs of the fierce independence that seemed to run in the women of this family. "She's going to be a heartbreaker, Frank," Morrison predicted, leaning in to make faces at the infant. "Look at those eyes, already taking in everything around her like she's planning to rearrange it to suit herself better. Heaven help us if she inherited her mother's determination along with her father's stubbornness," Judge Patterson said with a laugh. "Wyoming Territory won't know what hit it." The photographer emerged from beneath his cloth and began the careful process of preparing his equipment for the exposure. Around them, the Harvest Festival continued its cheerful chaos. Children running between the booths, selling everything from apple cider to hand-carved toys, women displaying their finest quilts and preserves for judging, men arguing good-naturedly about cattle prices and weather predictions for the coming winter. It was exactly the kind of community celebration that Rosalie had dreamed of during her lonely years back east, but never thought she'd actually experience. The warmth of belonging, the easy camaraderie of people who'd weathered hardships together, the sense of being part of something larger and more enduring than any individual life. "Ready," the photographer announced. "Everyone look this way and think pleasant thoughts." As the camera captured their image for posterity, Rosalie found herself thinking about the woman who had sat on that railway bench just 14 months ago. That frightened, desperate creature seemed like someone from another lifetime, connected to her present self by the thinnest thread of memory. The photograph session complete, they made their way through the festival crowds, stopping frequently to receive congratulations on the baby and updates on the continuing legal proceedings against Ben Wheeler. The land grabber was serving a 10-year sentence in federal prison, and his Eastern associates had been thoroughly discredited. The threat that had once seemed so overwhelming had been reduced to an unpleasant memory and a cautionary tale about the consequences of crossing honest people who refused to be intimidated. "Mrs. Holt," called Sarah Morrison, Frank's daughter-in-law, "I've got a question about that apple cake recipe you shared last month. Mine never turns out quite as light as yours." As Rosalie found herself drawn into a discussion of baking techniques and ingredient substitutions, she caught Calder's eye and saw him smile with the kind of deep contentment that comes from watching someone you love find their place in the world. She had become not just his wife, but a vital part of the community that had welcomed her so completely. The ranch had prospered during their first year of true partnership. The garden Rosalie had planted where Wheeler's men had trampled the ground now bloomed with both vegetables and flowers, creating a riot of color that could be seen from the main road. The house had been expanded with a nursery for Sarah Rose and a larger kitchen that could accommodate the dinners they'd begun hosting for neighboring families. Most importantly, the easy rhythm of shared work and mutual support had made their marriage something neither had dared to hope for during those first awkward months. "Remember when you were afraid you couldn't live up to Sarah's memory?" Calder asked quietly as they walked toward the wagon for the journey home. "I remember being afraid of a lot of things," Rosalie replied, adjusting the sleeping baby in her arms. "Seems foolish now, all that worry about living in someone else's shadow." "Not foolish, natural. But you were right when you said we needed to build something that was ours instead of trying to recreate what came before." They had found the perfect balance between honoring the past and embracing the future. Sarah's recipes still graced their table, but with Rosalie's modifications and additions. The wooden robin Calder had carved still sat on the mantelpiece, but now it was joined by other small treasures, a silver rattle that had been Sarah Rose's christening gift from Judge Patterson, Pressed flowers from Rosalie's garden, a small pair of knitted booties that Frank Morrison's wife had made for the baby. The house had become a home in the truest sense, filled with the accumulated artifacts of a life being lived fully and joyfully. As they loaded their purchases from the festival into the wagon, Sarah Rose began to fuss, and Rosalie settled onto the wagon seat to nurse her. The late afternoon sun painted the countryside in shades of gold and amber, and the first hints of autumn color were beginning to show in the trees along the creek beds. "Hard to believe it's been a year since Wheeler's arrest," Frank Morrison said, climbing up onto his own wagon seat. "Feels like a lifetime ago."